first session is focused on innovative partnerships to advance sustainability in agriculture, food security, and trade. And I think the question of whether the world will have sufficient quantities of food to feed its population and how it will produce and distribute sustainably this food are certainly among the most pressing issues that we have today, even if these issues are perhaps, and I know Juergen might disagree with me here, incidental somewhat to the global policy agenda, I think, at this present time. Certainly, that's a point of debate. We can come to that in a moment. I think, particularly the questions are quite fundamental, not least for this region, Asia, which of late has been a major importer of food, but where I think given the now realized production capacities in the United States, in Europe, in Russia, and elsewhere in the world, where Asia will have to, I think, meet its growing food demand largely from within. And I think this is a really quite critical and serious problem that we face. And I think we today at this panel are going to try and unravel some of those A, problems, and B, unravel some of the solutions, and think about what the innovative partnerships might be that will help try to drive new levels of food security and better productivity in agriculture particularly. And I've got five distinguished panelists to help me do this, and I hope I'm going to get all their names right, having just met them very early, just a few minutes ago. On my direct right, Juergen Voegele, Director for Agriculture and Rural Development of the World Bank, who's just flown in, I understand, at 2 o'clock this morning, so we're going to have to keep him alive with questions and observations from the audience. Next to Juergen, Paul Teng, Siong, Senior Fellow on Food Security at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technology University in Singapore. Next to Paul is Andrew McConville. Sorry, I beg your pardon, I did get it wrong. Next to Paul is Bruce Blakeman, who is the Vice President Corporate Affairs for the Asia Pacific for Cargill. Next to Bruce is Andrew McConville. And here I owe Andrew a slight apology right from the beginning. We didn't mention Syngenta as the key sponsor of this event, and Syngenta is, as I said, supporting this event financially, so a warm thanks to Syngenta. Andrew is the head of corporate affairs for APAC for Syngenta. And last but not least, we've got Adam Jarczyk, who is the practice leader for Asia Pacific for Frontier Strategy Group. So I'm going to ask each of the discussants to, first of all, speak for about 3 to 4 minutes, outline some of their key thoughts in around this subject area, and then we're going to go into a discussion. So let's start with Juergen. Juergen.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see such a turnout. Agriculture and food security wasn't always the most exciting topic to attend, so this is terrific. So I was sitting next to him, so he can kick me if I get sleepy, but I'm sure that's not going to happen. Let me just talk a little bit about where we are today in the world of agriculture and food security compared to just a couple of years ago. I actually think politicians and policymakers are getting it now. After 4 years of higher and volatile food prices and many associated problems around the world, people are getting it, that if we don't get our food security right, we will not get our national security right, and we will not get global security right. This is not just a production issue, this is a fundamental issue of our time. And we discussed this in the context of partnerships here because it is very clear to everybody, none of us individually around this panel or around this room or around the world can solve this alone. This issue is affecting everything and everybody as we speak. Let me give you a bit of a sense why we have these high food prices today, and we've had them now for the 3rd time in a row in 4 years. We've just gone through the 3rd major food price spike this summer. And we have this dramatic volatility. And let me share with you a little bit why I think this is not going to go away in the next decade. We will not go back to business as usual in the food environment for at least a decade. The reason for that is, and you alluded to already, the first thing is the consumption patterns. Consumption is rapidly growing around the world. It's growing in Asia, it's growing everywhere else in the world, and it's steady and it's rising. Production, on the other hand, is not doing the same. Yes, we are increasing production every year, but we are doing it not in a stable way, and it is not predictable as it used to be. We are now in the 4th year in a row where the world has produced less food than it consumes, all in. This is not a good prospect. The third issue, why I think this is going to be a problem going forward, is that our stock levels, and we have experts here in the panel that know more about it than I do, but the food stocks of this world are at historic lows today. They have been low for 5 years, and they are a major reason why we have this dramatic volatility in food prices, because people are just extremely nervous. It takes 1 or 2 major global events to get people really nervous. We've had 2 years ago a massive drought in Russia, many of you will remember. It unsettled the global food prices to an extent that nobody expected. We had a major issue this year in the United States. Fortunately, it wasn't worse than it was. If it would have been worse, we would be in a very difficult situation. We only have 6 weeks of food supply in the world today. If for some reason production stalls, we don't have very long to go. This is a fundamental reason why prices are high. Then we've continued high oil prices. Yes, they're a little lower now than they were a few weeks ago, but they're still high enough to make it more expensive and costly to increase production and productivity. And combined with the fact that combined with the volatility, meaning as a farmer, you don't know when you plant today and invest serious money what you get when you sell, that there is a strong disincentive not to go where we really want to be. Then we have climate issues. I mentioned it already. It is becoming clear to everybody that the climate is changing. Not only 20, 30, 50 years from now, it is changing today. And the risks of major events are getting higher and higher. And the last point is biofuels and other alternative uses. We have seen increasing consumption of biofuels in the United States. About 40% of the corn production goes into biofuels, and the bioethanol and biodiesel. This is an issue. Okay, I don't think we need to say this is good or bad, but what we need going forward is more flexibility at the time of high and volatile food prices and food shortages. Okay, the world needs to deal with these issues with this flexibility, particularly the poor. So we need social safety nets that are functioning in every country to protect the poor. We need to make sure that governments don't do silly policies. And with silly policies, I mean unreasonable export bans, slapping terrorists on trade, etc., etc. The world needs a functioning trading system at a time when we have very little food in our stores, when demand's rapidly growing. Without that, we will be finding ourselves in a much more difficult situation.
Thank you, Juergen, very much. I want to come back to those points a little bit later. You've raised lots of good points. But Paul, let's carry on with you. If you could just give your thoughts in 3 or 4 minutes.
Well, let me start by echoing, I think, what Juergen has said. I think food security is a foundational imperative for sustainability. You know, whatever view we make of it. I think what we also recognize now is that food security is complex. Okay? You know, in the 60s and 70s of the last century, we tended to view food security from the viewpoint of supply, mainly, availability. Today, it's more than that. Okay? In a country like Singapore, that's more obvious than any other country. As most of you know, I think Singapore imports more than 90% of its food. It's a very food-vulnerable country. It relies on the global supply chain for its food. Now, because of that, the question of physical access to food, transport, and so on, infrastructure policies are very key. That's a key component of food security. The third then, as Juergen has mentioned, is economic access to food. We find that even in a country in Singapore, which purportedly is one of the richest countries in the world, we still have people who live in the land of plenty, yet have no access to the basic items. Yeah, so economic access is very key. And that's the third dimension of food security now, which many governments have started to recognize, hence safety nets and so on. The fourth really is utilization of food, the diet question. Is food nutritious enough? Even if you get enough calories, are you meeting your daily needs in terms of the nutrition values? Let me just share very quickly four major points. I think one is this question of urbanization. I think as most of us know, you know, post-2008, the world's become an urban society. Predictions for Asia are actually quite threatening. By 2025, we expect about 15 megacities. So the question then is, who is going to feed those people in the cities? Now, I look at that, you know, it's not part of the problem, but part of the solution. I wrote a commentary for Today recently, where I actually pushed very hard the fact that cities should be practicing some level of farming, and it should be part of the solution instead of being viewed as part of the problem. Yeah? So urbanization is the key phenomenon. We've started seeing some countries, China for example, tackling this issue by having food production within cities. We've seen more enlightened high-tech cities like Seoul, Tokyo, actually practicing urban farming. So the urbanization question is the key question to me that drives our discussion of food security. Lots of opportunities for the business world to intervene there. Third really deals with diet changes. And that's even more worrisome. I think we've seen now the convergence of diets in countries that have seen a big growth in the middle-class populations, close to what the US and North America and Europe, which is approximating. Roughly 25%, for example, of the daily diet of Americans comes from protein. We're seeing in the last 30 years, the Chinese diet has moved that way. Now, the frightening picture is this. You know, it takes about 7 kilos of grain to produce 1 kilo of beef. It takes about 16 liters of water to produce 1 kilo of beef. And as we know, Asia itself doesn't have enough land area, basically, to produce grain. We're a net grain importer. Okay? Which brings me to my next point. If you look at Asia as a food-producing continent, 34% arable land, but 36% available water resources. We are the biggest importer of grain. About 70% of the world's soybeans, exportable soybeans, comes to Asia. About 39% of the world's corn comes to Asia. So we're actually very vulnerable to any potential disruptions in the global supply chain, which is the other point I was going to make, the global supply chain. Now, if I go back to my fourth point, which is food security, and that really is the topic for this particular panel. We can't solve food security by looking at, from the perspective of, say, the public sector alone, or the private sector for that matter. There's got to be strong partnerships to ensure food security. There's actually a third partner missing from this discussion, civil society. Yeah, civil society is very key to assuring us economic access to food amongst the poor, also in terms of production of food, availability. The poorest of the poor, as the World Bank knows, we require civil society action to make sure that technology actually gets to these poorest of the poor so that they can be active participants in the food production cycle. So I'll leave it at that, I think, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Paul. Bruce, can we move on to you?
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. It's afternoon now. I'd like to make a couple points building off of the other speakers, which I absolutely agree with, which is this point about food security and where do we need to go and what do we need to be doing. The fact is that 80% of the world's food is grown in the Northern Hemisphere. So it is important to be able to move food to get it to where it needs to go. And the other part, and more of a positive note, is over the last 40 years, we basically fed the world off the same about 100 million hectares of land. So it has been intensification of agricultural land that has essentially fed the world over the last 40 years, even with the growing population and growing incomes. So essentially, the way that we view the world at Cargill, and we're one of the biggest food movers and distributors in the world, is really need to do two things. Number one, we need to grow more calories, produce more calories. But number two, and just as important, is to get it to where it needs to go. And looking at growing more calories, essentially, again, yield intensification has got to be a critical part of where we go. There isn't a lot more land, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but how do we continue to get more off the same land? And that's sustainable because if we can grow more food on the same amount of land, that doesn't mean we need to be converting forests or whatnot to agriculture and to be able to grow the food that we need to do. Part of that is growing the right food in the right soil with the right weather. And having farmers make the right decisions to grow the right crops for the right climates that they live in, and grow it to excess, eat what you need to eat, and trade the rest. Another part of this is the whole question about smallholders. Smallholders are key to feeding the world, and we're talking about people that may have 0.2 hectares or 2 hectares of land where they're basically growing food to both feed their family, but also as a source of income and trade. And there's a big gap there on how do we get smallholders to be more productive in this world. A big part of that is training. And what we've seen over the last few years is governments have pulled back very significantly on their ag extension services. In other words, helping smallholder farmers understand how to be better farmers and be more productive. And again, that's a role that the private sector can also help with. Providing smallholders with good market information so that they know what the prices are so they can make the decisions. I think Charles made the comment, that there's investments. If somebody puts a crop in the field, that there's money, there's a cost to do that, but what are they going to get at the other end? And with the volatility of the markets today, they don't know what kind of profit they're going to see from that. Another very important aspect of smallholders is land ownership. A lot of studies have come out that show that smallholders who actually have some sort of title over their land are 30% more productive if they know that they have title over their land. So again, in a lot of countries you see where smallholders don't have title or it's informal title, and they won't make investments if they don't have that sense of security of ownership. And then lastly, but certainly not leastly, access to the best technology. Getting the right technology, the right seeds, the right pesticides, the right fertilizers, the best irrigation techniques into these farmers' hands so that they can be more successful. And again, you can imagine all the government policies that go around that. The last point I'd like to make on the production and yield piece is Africa. Today, Africa contains probably about 60% of the land that's available for agriculture. And today, Africa is a net food importer. So again, part of the solution to feeding the world will rest on Africa and what happens in Africa. The last point I'd like to make is about getting food to where it needs to go. And that's about distribution. So it doesn't matter if you grow it, you got to be able to trade it, and it's about open trade, export bans that were talked about before. It's also including standards harmonization. If you can't move food across borders because you can't meet the standards, it doesn't do any good. Infrastructure to be able to move that food, and last but certainly see biofuels mandates and biofuels policies.
Thank you, Bruce. I mean, interesting you mentioned Africa as a potential source of new food production. A green revolution in Africa, question mark, I think is something that we might want to ask. But Andrew, let's talk a little bit about food inputs.
Thanks,
yep.
Thanks Charles. Sort of quite apt, I suppose, following on from Bruce. Bruce and I spent a lot of time together traipsing around ASEAN in particular, trying to convince agricultural ministers and trade ministers and economic ministers to many of the points we've raised. And so that really leads me to my first point. We at Syngenta, we're an agricultural inputs company, the world's largest pesticide and seed company. And so we're sort of at the other end of the chain, if you like, to Cargill, bringing some of that technology. And what it says and what we see travelling around, talking to policymakers and so on, that, I mean, it's absolutely, as everyone has said, a multi-sectoral challenge. Sustainability, agricultural productivity and food security, no one has all of the answers and everyone has to be moving in the same direction. And whilst it's very easy to say, it is very, very difficult to do because inherently agriculture, particularly in Asia, is enormously political. We hear about the Farm Bill in the US and the politics that comes with that. I mean, it pales into insignificance when you look at the ways in which governments want to get their hands into agriculture in Asia. Now that's understandable because food is so incredibly important to Asia, as Paul, very clearly outlined. And so, there is no one technology, there is no one sector of the economy, there is no one firm that can bring the sorts of solutions that we need. But when you peel it back and you put it all together, the answers are most certainly there. And within that, sustainability is absolutely paramount. People look at an organisation like ours and say, well, what does sustainability matter to an agricultural inputs company? Well, it's very, very simple because we need farmers to be farming tomorrow for us to have a business. So it makes perfect sense for us to be investing very, very heavily in sustainability. And most importantly, I think educating farmers as to sustainability. People worry about smallholder farmers, and there are about 450 million smallholder farmers in the world. Smallholder farmer is a farmer we classify less than 100 hectares. There's about 5 million large-scale farmers, so above 100 hectares. So there's 450 million smallholder farmers. And yet, what history tells us and what experience tells us, if you make the technology available to those smallholder farmers, they'll do a couple of things. The first thing they'll do is feed their family. The second thing they'll do is send their kids to school. And the third thing they'll do is invest it back into the farm. Okay? And it doesn't matter what size, whether it's 0.2 of a hectare or 20 hectares or 200 hectares. The pattern is universal. And so farmers will uptake technology if you can get it into their hands. The problem is bad government policy, inadequate protection of intellectual property rights, inadequate investment in infrastructure. All of these things tend to stand in the way of getting that technology. Similarly, as Bruce said, extension services, you can have the best technology in the world, but if you put it into the hands of a farmer and he doesn't know how to use it or she doesn't know how to use it, it's not going to deliver the sort of return on investment that farmer expects. And every farmer, no matter how small, knows about return on investment, and they know what it takes to make a dollar and get a return on that dollar. You know, looking at the challenge of smallholder farmers, there's 450 million of them. To meet the food security challenge, they have to increase their productivity by about 200%. So that's not 20, it's 200%. But it can actually be done. I mean, global rice yields today could be increased by 30% just by using the existing technology we have more effectively. Similarly, I mean, you look at rice yields in the US, 9 tonnes per hectare, thereabouts, 4.5 tonnes per hectare in Asia. There is no reason agronomically why those yields couldn't be increased to 9 tonnes per hectare. So, you know, the scope and capacity is there, but it is about, you know, access to technology, affordability, access to markets, as Bruce mentioned, infrastructure, investments in storage, you know, rail and road transport to move the grain, to store the grain. Now, 40% of food produce in India is lost through the supply chain. Billions and billions of dollars of food is literally rotting on the side of the road because there's no adequate storage. So, you know, government policy insight, government policy foresight, and the role that, you know, the NGO sector, the private sector, the public sector can play in bringing that together is extremely important. And understanding those linkages and what drives those linkages. And we've done a lot of work recently through a thing called the Rice Bowl Index, where we look at the enablers and disablers of food security. And, you know, what that tells us is, you know, if you can get balance in your production system, if you can get balance in your trade and policy settings, if you can get balance in your commitment to the environment, you know, your overall level of food security can increase quite substantially. So I'm happy to explore that some more.
Adam, can you just pick up, you did this Rice Bowl Index, didn't you?
Yes, I was involved in it. My company, Frontier Strategy Group, we partnered with Syngenta as well as Dr. Teng to develop it.
Great. Could you just pick up from where Andrew left off then and tell us a little bit about that index? Sure
thing. So the Rice Bowl Index was developed in conjunction with Syngenta, in conjunction with Dr. Teng, as well as on the advice of experts from a variety of different industries that touch agriculture, because there seemed to be a need in the market for an index that didn't simply look at which countries had the highest levels of poverty or which countries had the most hungry people, but instead looked at which countries were the most prepared for volatility in food prices or for a crisis. So we developed the Rice Bowl Index, which is a quantitative tool that measures countries' food security preparedness. I won't go into too many details here, but from a high level, there were some pretty interesting findings as we developed this index. It looks at countries' food security preparedness over the course of a decade and out to 2015, so from 2000 to 2015. And what we found when we began digging into this issue is that food security is such a complex challenge that it's practically impossible to create a comprehensive list of factors that a country will need to achieve sustainability. It just can't be done. But what we found was that many, if not most, of these factors could be combined into 4 broad categories, each of which is necessary but not sufficient to attain sustainability in Asia and indeed across the globe. The 4 categories were farm-level factors, so factors that determine whether farmers have the capability and means to be productive. Policy and trade factors, so they're looking at factors that encourage open markets, investment, innovation, and environmental factors as well, factors that determine whether a country has the environmental capabilities that it needs for long-term agricultural productivity. And finally, demand and price factors, so factors that determine how the food security requirements of a country are going to evolve in terms of quantity, affordability, and access. What we found is that no one set of factors is a consistent indicator of food security, as I mentioned before. Instead, our analysis suggests that countries with the greatest levels of food security are those that are balanced across the 4 categories. The data indicates that countries which have one particular set of factors as the dominant characteristic in its market are more vulnerable to shocks, have less robust systems, and are subject to much greater fluctuations. Intuitively, this makes sense. The countries with the highest levels of food security generally exhibit balance because there is no silver bullet for this multifactorial issue. And so our conclusion fundamentally was that any solution that's going to lead to increased levels of sustainability is going to have to involve a number of interrelated factors, and those factors, the policies that drive those factors, are going to have to be well thought through. The solutions are going to have to be comprehensive, not piecemeal.
Thank you, Adam. I'd like to come back, I think. I mean, we ranged over a wide set of issues there, but I think I want to come back, and before we start discussing this whole question of the partnerships that are needed to deliver interesting solutions here, I just wanted to come back to one area which I think everybody raised, and particularly important, was the whole question of productivity. And this sense that enormous gains can be made quite readily by looking at inputs, technologies, land reform, certainty of land use, and so on and so forth. And I wonder, Juergen, if I could start with you and just sort of ask you to reflect on, I suppose, what the priorities would be and why we're having such difficulty, why governments are having such difficulty. You mentioned silly governments, but I don't think in this case, in this particular case, but silly decisions, exactly. Well, governments can be silly too, I think, but at least broadly. Why it is that we're having such problems moving to create, for example, certainty in land use rights and sort of greater levels of private participation in technology transfer to farmers. What is the set of issues that sit there? What are the priorities and what are the difficulties?
It's the key question. If you want to feed 9 billion people going forward, it can only happen if we increase production and productivity on the existing land that we have. Expansion is not an option. Maybe 10%, but we need to almost double food production. So productivity increase is absolutely key. It's a complex issue because productivity depends on many factors, as my colleagues have already sort of discussed a little bit earlier, but it's absolutely key to do this. It starts with the highest end research, R&D. We are not investing enough money in going to the next generation of production and productivity. This is true in the public sector more than the private sector. The private sector is ramping up. The public sector is not really. We need to invest a lot more in getting our productivity up, particularly for smallholder farmer agriculture types. It's the beans, the millets of this world that need the attention because they are feeding the next 3 billion people on this planet more than they have in the past. Because the 3 billion people that will be born in the next 40 years will all be born in food insecure parts of the world. They will not be born in the United States or in Europe or in places where it's safe. So we need to increase investment. We used to be able, in the public R&D environment, CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, the background of the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, used to be able to produce 3 to 4 to 5% productivity increase in the rice, wheat, corn crops at that time per year per hectare. Today we're down to about 1, and maybe 1.5 if we're lucky. That's less than population growth. We are not winning the battle the way we are working right now. We need to reverse that. So that's key, investment in that. Then productivity depends on a whole raft of factors. Government policies just being a very important one. And I think from the private sector perspective, it is the key to get what you have as technology to the smallholder farm. You need to have an environment that allows you to do that. Then productivity, water productivity, crop per drop, absolutely essential. We know what needs to be done where we're not doing it. Again, partly because we're not valuing it properly. I'm looking at Power. We all know that it needs to be done, but farmers aren't doing it because they're not getting rewarded for it. It doesn't add up, which is hopefully the conversation this afternoon, how we get from here to where we need to be very rapidly. And I could go on and on this. If we don't do productivity right, we will not solve the world's problems. The World Bank, we have in the last 4 years increased our investment in agriculture broadly from $2.5 billion a year with our client countries to about 9.5 last year. That is an unprecedented and unbelievable increase in what we are doing. 70% of that money goes into production and productivity improvements, because that is the ultimate key. Yes, there are many others, access to markets, storage, all these things, post-harvest losses, the nutritional elements. But the essence, if we don't win the first race, the others will not be where we will have the conversation. Now, let me just say one point on land tenure. Land tenure is absolutely critical. One of my colleagues made the point about that when you own your land, and it doesn't have to be private ownership, it is the land right, the right to use the land that is secure, you will be more productive. It is absolutely clear, the evidence is absolutely crystal clear. And we need to work together to make that happen. Many of you will know the story of China. China has always fed itself, more or less, in the last 30 years. But the productivity and production per hectare 25 years ago was half to what it is today. The reason it is where it is today is because of the household responsibility system. That even though nobody owns farmland in China, the farmers in China today know that they have the right to this land for 15 or 30 years or 50 years in some environments. That is what transformed the way they think and the way they invest and the way they manage and steward their land. And this does not have to be formal land use rights. There are also customary land use rights which can be put in place that work for them. It is not about private versus public or customary versus communal land. As long as the individual household knows they have the right to that piece of land for a certain period of time, they will invest, and that's what we need to stand for. We actually do put about $2 billion, we have a $2 billion program globally in about 45 countries in the world to help governments get this right, get the tenure systems right. It's a very important part of productivity.
But clearly in some ways they're not, are they? So we're still in a situation where we have a long way to go, it seems to me. We've got 1 billion people that are not being fed properly at the moment, and we've got a problem, a cliff of another 2 to 3 billion people coming into the world. Can I just, so this issue of investment seems to me to be quite critical. Investment in technology, investment in R&D. I wonder, Paul, can I just sort of throw this to you? Why aren't we seeing the investment in agriculture that we need to?
Well, I think I'll actually reword the question slightly. Why aren't we making the right investments? Okay? I think there's a difference there. I mean, I accept the fact that, the point that Bruce and I think Juergen has raised, that if you look at it at the macro level, yes, investments in agriculture have been declining across the world. It's starting to pick up now. But then the question that begs to be asked then is that even if it picks up, what do we invest in? Okay? Now, if we look at R&D, private sector is investing quite a large amount in R&D, so is the public sector. We may argue maybe not enough. Okay? Now, I look at the productivity issue in a slightly different way. A lot of the R&D has focused on basically increasing the potential yield, okay, of crops and animals. Now, not enough attention has been placed on looking at the yield gap that exists right now. The recovery of losses. We know that we're losing quite a bit at the moment, both at the farm level, also in the transport, storage, and processing level. Figures up to 50 to 70% have been lost. I think Andy mentioned India and the storage issue. Indian scientists, Indian bureaucrats will tell you they're losing a lot of grain through improper storage. So straight away you can actually address the particular issue. To me, the productive issue actually, and this is where the investment comes in, is that if you look at the figure that Andy gave, there's over 400 million small farmers in Asia. That's how we differentiate ourselves from North America, big farms, yeah? Which means that you have to level up the management expertise of a big mass of people. Okay, can they manage water properly? Can they manage fertilizer properly? Do they have access to credit? Are they using technology that's appropriate to the environment? Now that's where I think insufficient investments have been put in. And this goes to extension, the issue of extension. Private sector has tried to do that through their own technical services, extending, in fact, their own package of technologies, with corn, soybeans, and so on, to help small farmers grow and basically recover what they've invested in. To me, that's a question of recovery. The potential yield is there. Even with rice, we know the potential is up to 14 tons per hectare, yet average yields are 4 to 5 tons. What's wrong? And surveys, I used to work at the International Rice Research Institute, and surveys have done show that a lot of times farmers don't apply fertilizer at the right time, or the right amount. They don't manage the water appropriately. They don't have access to pest control measures, or they're using the wrong pesticides for that matter. Okay? So it calls for partnerships, integrated approaches. There ain't any silver bullet approaches, basically, to solving food security and productivity issues. It's got to be a multi-sectorial, integrated approach to solving those issues. And definitely, the correct kind of investments have to be made. I personally feel that at the country level is where the action is. Unless you tackle small farmers at the country level, incentivize them, make sure that the appropriate technologies are used at the right time, you're not going to solve the problem of productivity.
Bruce, if you could just pick up on the point there around wastage. I mean, as a producer yourself, wastage clearly is a critical issue, and investment in infrastructure seems to me to be absolutely central to this. If we're wasting so much food, that's a crime in a way, isn't it, in many ways? I mean, we're not only wasting food at farm level, we're also wasting food at the supermarket level as well. We're wasting food which we should be frankly ensuring that we consume. So can I just sort of ask you to reflect on what it is we need to do to think about how to improve investment in the wastage side of food?
Well, you make a good point that there's waste all across the supply chain. So right from the field, in the transport, in the processing, and once consumers buy it, and particularly us in North America are probably the worst at that. We probably waste about 30% of the food that sits in our refrigerator. So we're probably the worst around the globe about that piece. But essentially what we're looking at is the opportunity, and I think the private sector can play a big role in this. I mean, we're the ones that know how to do cold chain storage and move it, and move food around to keep it from spoiling. But what are the issues? The issues tend to be around government policy and the ability to be able to do that and to be able to move that food from farm gate to where it needs to go, and the policies around the ability to have access to that food and move it to where it goes. So I think that's a very big piece that we need to address. On the public side, certainly the investments in roads, ports, and other types of facilities that allow you to move the food from the field and the farm gate to where it needs to go, whether that be domestically or internationally. So on-farm storage again would be another very, very important piece to be able to do this. I mean, you look at smallholder farmers. I mean, they can invest into a silo or dryers or whatnot. So how does the public sector and the private sector work together to be able to provide this kind of resource and assets to farmers, and then working that through the supply chain? So again, it goes back to the point that all of us have made earlier is that there is no one solution. The private sector isn't the answer. The government's not the answer. It's how do we sit down and kind of figure out what needs to happen and move it forward. And one of the things, and again, Andy and I spend a lot of time on this, and the big problem on the public sector side is that it's not just one ministry. It's not the Ministry of Agriculture. It's the Ministry of Agriculture, it's the Ministry of Trade, it's the customs officials, the tax officials, and we look at even the Western governments. These departments don't work well together. Well, it's even more chaotic in this part of the world for them to be very, very siloed and try to get a coordinated policy moving these things forward. So what we need to have is some sort of function or fashion or consultation that allows these different ministries to get together, both in a domestic sense and an international sense, to work together to come up with plans.
I think you raise an important point about government dysfunction, and Andrew, I just want to come back to a point that you were making about governments seem to be suggesting that governments intervene in agriculture in ways which aren't always appropriate and helpful. I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate on that a little bit and tell us why you think that is.
Maybe I'm harking back to my days as a... I used to be an agricultural economist, so... yeah, look, I think, if you take Thailand at the moment, we're seeing a completely adverse sort of production impacts by virtue of the government intervening in the rice market and setting a price for rice which is way above where the market is. So what we're actually seeing is rice traders going across the border into countries like Myanmar, buying rice, bringing it back across the border and selling it in Thailand, and then just sitting on it because they can get the price. And when they do their sums, they look at the price they can buy it for, the price they get paid for it in Thailand, the price it costs to store it, and it's not going anywhere. So you start to really have an adverse impact on sort of production incentives. If you look at what happened when Russia intervened into the wheat market 12, 18 months ago. I mean, Russia generally contributes around about 4 to 5% to global export wheat trade. Yet when they shut their borders, global wheat prices went up by 70%. So, you know, it has a contagion effect, and it has a flow-on effect. And when you're a smallholder farmer, or when you're at that end of the agricultural investment chain, or indeed when you're actually a consumer, if people worry about high prices, it's actually not the high prices that's the real problem. It's the volatility in the prices, because it has a negative impact on investment decisions. And so if in year one you're thinking, well, you know, my price is $100 a quintal, and then in year two it's 120, and in year three it's 85, it really influences whether you're going to invest, and you start to get this sort of very myopic production system that operates for the smallholder farmer. Similarly, for consumers, if they know that they have to allocate 30% of their income to buying food, then they can manage that, or 40 or 50. Obviously, we want it to be lower, but they can manage that. It's when it goes up and down that it really starts to cause problems. And when it goes up and down, that, you know, it has the flow-on effect to the wider economy. And so, you know, what government interventions do in markets is they increase volatility. And volatility is certainly not the friend of food security. And, you know, I mean, governments, unfortunately, are very ham-fisted at the way in which they intervene in markets. Generally, they intervene too late and they intervene too heavily. And so you get this, you know, completely adverse flow-through effect. And the pendulum always swings too far, and that has a very negative impact on investment decisions at the smallholder level, and then it flows right through the value chain to companies like ours who are investing in innovation and R&D and technology, through to companies like Cargill that are investing in the supply chain. It just throws off all of the incentives, and all of the incentives become perverse, and so the system really starts to break down from within when that happens.
Well, let's just pick up there. I think that's price volatility. You mentioned, Juergen, a little bit earlier, and a hugely difficult problem. And this complex dilemma, I think, between food security and the temptation to self-sufficiency is one that I think is worth just exploring a little bit here. Why isn't it, perhaps, in the best interest of countries to want self-sufficiency, and why is trade, you know, important in this respect, and what is it about free trade that makes food security secure, us have food security?
I think we're in the right place to have this conversation, right? How would you make Singapore food self-sufficient? I think you have 3 farms, right? I was told. I mean, serious farms. Okay, well, that's an example, but there are many countries that just don't have an environment that allows them to feed their populations. The Middle East countries are a prime example. Why would you want to use the really scarce water resources you have for producing wheat, which can be produced elsewhere in the world much cheaper, much less environmentally devastating, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a question food self-sufficiency is bad and trade is good. No, wherever there is an environment where it makes sense to produce your own food, do as much as you can, sensibly, without massive government interference that artificially then distorts the whole picture. Nobody argues against, if a country has the natural resources and the means to do so, they should by all means produce as much food as they can. But that is the reality maybe for 2/3 of the countries. 1/3 of the countries around the globe are absolutely import dependent and not artificially import dependent. It just doesn't make sense for them to be self-sufficient.
Paul, can I ask you to reflect on that too?
Just echoing the same points, really. I think, you know, the opportunity cost of trying to raise yourself to a level of sufficiency is just too high, really. You know, in environments, countries that have environments where you can produce a certain level of food, by all means do so, but increase the productivity in those environments. That's what the investment should be. Now, the other kind of side phenomenon really is that, you know, increasingly the food supply chain is being globalized, increasingly, whether we like it or not. The supermarket phenomenon is just one evidence of that globalization. Okay? So again, it comes back to the fact it doesn't make sense. There's no comparative advantage, really. You know, if you can ship food from somewhere else, much cheaper prices, you know, and available quantities. Now that's where the caveat is, the availability. And some governments resort to self-sufficiency because they're afraid that basically the supply chain might be interrupted. So rightly or wrongly, you know, they would up their level of sufficiency, right? You know, sacrificing economics, really. Doesn't make economic sense at all. Yeah. So I'm actually, in a sense, echoing what Juergen is saying.
Bruce.
Just to put it in perspective, First of all, only about 14% of food crosses international borders. So most countries are feeding themselves most of their food dramatically. But the importance of trade is to be able to get things that don't make any sense that you can grow in your own country. Look at China and soybeans. China grows about 13 million tons of soybeans now. They import between 50 and 60 million tons. What they've made a strategic decision is that we're going to be self-sufficient in wheat, rice, and corn. We're going to grow what we need. We're not going to expand our soybean, but we're going to rely on the rest of the world to supply those soybeans. And they've got America, they've got Canada, they've got Australia, they've got Argentina, they've got Brazil to be able to supply those soybeans. So that's very, very critical in that and making those strategic decisions and trusting the international system. The other part is, self-sufficiency doesn't make a lot of sense, particularly as when you're forcing smallholder farmers to grow things that aren't productive in the land and the weather that you have in. Who suffers? That smallholder farmer. They should be growing the things that grow the best and most efficiently in the ground and the weather that they have, not only because you're going to get more food, your yields are going to go up, but it puts more money in their pocket. Because small businessmen small farmers are great businessmen, as Andy was saying. They understand return on investment, and my point that I want to make here is you got to let markets work, because people will make the right decision. They'll expand the growing area, they'll contract the growing area, they'll grow this crop, they'll grow that crop. They'll make these decisions if they've got good market information. And once you start looking at government interference and self-sustainability kinds of issues where they don't get clear market signals, they're going to make decisions that aren't the best for the global good of all. And my last point is that why is trade important is that global price volatility is certainly a lot less than your domestic price volatility. Because if you have a problem in your home market, something happens and all of a sudden prices spike up. The only way you're going to solve that problem is go to the global market so you can increase supply. So looking at your food supply in a global context provides less volatility on your prices.
We won't have any truck with The Economist, of course, talking about free markets. Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, again, I come back to my point about sort of governments being ham-fisted. And it's actually rather ironic because what tends to happen is we're a multinational company and we've been in Asia for generally 50 to 60 years in most of the markets we've been in. And so we've been working to increase agricultural productivity, and that tends to go through a cycle. And the cycle tends to play out that at some point the government says, well, actually we can do this on our own now and we don't need you. And so you start to see sort of interventions that are dressed in the guise of food security. And we're seeing it right at this moment in Indonesia, where there's sort of restrictions on both imports and exports of food. And the irony is that the technology and the techniques that have got a country to the point where they start to even think in that mindset is exactly the technology and the sort of the expertise that gets shut out once you start to sort of intervene in those markets. And from a farmer's perspective, they want access to the best available technology. Now, from a government's perspective, what they worry about is they worry about farmers becoming dependent on, one sort of technology or one provider of technology. Well, the best antidote to that is to make sure your markets are open, not closed, because you will see that domestic players will come to dominate a market as well if allowed. So it's rather perverse that in fact the very thing that could prevent what they're concerned about is the very thing they're stopping, and that is keeping markets open. And it can be done in all sorts of innovative ways, from sort of preferential treatment for domestic producers. It can be intellectual property regimes, failure to move quickly on harmonisation, quarantine restrictions, all of these things. And at the end of the day, none of them really make that sense, and they're all very, very blunt tools. And I mean, back to Bruce's point, let markets work. I was going to make a comment about the R&D piece. I mean, we as a company, we invest about $1.1 billion a year in R&D. Between the big 6 multinational agricultural inputs, we invest collectively more than any one government anywhere in the world. We invest collectively about $8 billion a year in R&D, very close to the $9 billion that Juergen mentioned. And I think where the shift is coming in that R&D spend is to try and move that from a paradigm of sort of single product solutions or pushing a certain sort of angle, if you like, to more integrated solutions. So we do have to look at the ways in which we can integrate the value chain from the technology point of view, and then also the adjacencies, market access, storage, and so on. Because from a farmer's perspective, I mean, a farmer wants to grow the best possible crop. He doesn't sort of look at his crop and go, well, I'm going to deal with my weeds today and I'm going to deal with my disease tomorrow and I'll look at my traits next year and so on. And he just says, I want to grow the best possible corn crop. So I think from a research and development perspective, certainly we are seeing a shift in the way in which research and development is also being done to be more integrated and to look at the end-to-end solutions. I think that is a shift, and that's one that governments need to come onto, and the private sector is starting down that path. So I just want to add that point back to the R&D, but I think on the interventions, it's a very perverse set of circumstances that in the end constrains only the people they're actually trying to help, which is the farmers.
Adam, briefly, yeah.
Just briefly, it's interesting, working with a number of different companies across industries, it seems as though the biggest obstacle to effective public-private partnership, to bring it back to innovative partnerships, is a lack of trust. Very often government officials feel as though corporations' profit motives distort their policy suggestions. And so very often, very productive, potentially positive policy solutions are left on the table. You see this in places like Indonesia, you see it in places like India. And so fundamentally, when you start getting into issues of politics in Asia where farmers do play such a large role in politicians' considerations, you're going to face challenges. But if there are ways that we can build tools, build organizations to increase that levels of trust, the dividends are going to be manifold. I mean, the fact that Bruce and Andy had to go touring Southeast Asia to convince governments to let them help increase yields and increase productivity is a demonstration of this lack of trust.
Okay, thanks. I mean, there is another question that I would like to sort of explore there, but I think we need to get on, and I'm conscious that we haven't asked the audience to ask any questions, and I'm conscious too that there are a whole set of issues that we want to discuss around partnerships. One thing that didn't arise when we were talking about trade, and one of the problems that's been raised on numerous occasions by those countries where there are large numbers of smallholders, is that there tends to be a large concentration of trade in large players, and that smallholders, who interestingly are a focus now of the big companies, are perhaps left out of that trade to some degree. And I suppose there's a question around how on earth do you get those smallholders to engage in this global market. And I wonder, just very briefly, if we could just quickly ask you, Bruce and Andrew and Juergen, just to answer that.
And you hit a big nail on the head. And basically, where our focus is at is how do you build market power with individual smallholders? And we spend a lot of time and effort in trying to train and develop cooperatives. Because I'll tell you what, it's certainly in my interest as Cargill to be able to work with one cooperative who can sell me tens and hundreds of tons versus a guy who can sell me a half a ton. I can't buy a half a ton of product from a smallholder. You come to me with 10,000 tons, I want to deal with you because that's the scale that we operate at. So one of the things that we like to see is an emphasis on, both from the government sector and the private sector, is how do we build market strength with an association of smallholders and help them do that. And again, Andrew and I, we could give you 50 examples of the things that we're doing to try to do that, because it's certainly in the farmer's interest and it's certainly in our interest.
Yeah, I think two things. I mean, understanding better the market linkages. So, it's amazing for a smallholder farmer when you really sort of peel it back that they don't understand what the end user wants. So trying to create that linkage, we do it in Brazil and Latin America with coffee producers, actually getting some roasters in to sit down with the smallholder farmers and say, this is what we want, and then working with them through the genetic profile to deliver that. So creating those sort of adjacent linkages. And I think the second one is again, access to technology. Using mobile phones to give farmers better access to price information. I mean, we've worked with Nokia in India to really, really simple. Basically, what happens in India, a farmer grows his crop, he has to deliver it to the local market because the infrastructure's not there, and he takes the price on the day. And historically, they don't know whether that's a good price or bad price. By simply providing that farmer with market price information from 4 or 5 markets around there on his mobile phone, he can tell whether he's being screwed or not. And so the market power starts to shift back to the farmer in terms of negotiating price. And You can do that with a whole range of other technologies as well. So I think technology, I would say technologies and adjacencies and sort of that whole value chain are key for linking smallholder farmers and helping them.
And this brings in, Juergen, the key point about public-private partnerships and how those can help transform this whole process of food security and agriculture. Could you just reflect on that? Yeah.
It's absolutely the key question. It's not, is smallholder farming better than large farming or big versus small? The point is, how do you bring them together in the most effective way? We will continue to have hundreds of millions of smallholder farms in this world for at least a couple of generations. How do we help them access the market is the key. We've just looked at 800 of those kind of partnerships, if you want, or investments, if you want, in developing countries over the last 40 years. And it turned out that those few, and it's not many, who've managed to get this right were the most successful. They had the best technology transfer, they had the best resilience in the system, because the outside investment reduces the risk. They had the best income effect on the households. And the whole, if it's done right, it works. So our challenge is to get it right. And that's why we need these partnerships between public and private and big and small and the local NGOs and governments. And if you want me to, just a couple of words, I mean, this is where it's been going just over the last 2 to 3 years. You mentioned this issue of trust and mistrust. I think 5 or 10 years ago it would have been inconceivable to have real public-private partnerships on a grand scale. Today it's not anymore. I think we're breaking down these barriers. We're building the trust in many different fora. It will take a lot more than 10 minutes to get into these where this is already working. There are already good examples of how to do it, whether it's in the oceans, whether it's on food safety, whether it's on what we are just discussing now, which is natural capital accounting. We are beginning to converge between what the private sector's interests are, what the government what the government's interest is, what the smallholder producer's interest is, what the NGO's interest is. Just in the last 18 to 24 months, I've seen a massive sea change in behavior across many of these partners. And I'm actually very optimistic from where I sit to believe that these partnerships will be more than talk shops and more than paper writers. It'll be actually action on the ground. And we see a lot of good examples of this already, and we certainly at the bank are very excited about that.
Well, thank you. Let me just, we've got 10 minutes left before lunch. Let me just throw this to the audience and see whether, once I've got my glasses on, see whether you've got any thoughts, observations, or indeed questions for the panelists here. Right at the top. But if you could just say your name and organization. Thanks. Mike Sinman.
Yes, thank you. My name is David Storman. I'm with the Convention on Biological Diversity. First of all, I'd like to say it was a fascinating panel, fascinating discussion. I have a bit of a double-barrel question, if I may, with regard to investment, particularly in partnerships, public sector. First of all, how do you see leveraging government interest in a time of market volatility, financial volatility, where austerity is the way word? Everything's being cut back, but you need more money to tackle this crisis. And I guess in addition, you were talking about the issue of protectionism and self-sufficiency, and yet in many countries, the farm sector, the rural sector, is disproportionately represented in parliament. And of course, politicians tend to pander to those smaller seats because they have to. That's where they keep them safe. North America and Canada, I'm from Canada, that's obviously the case. I've seen it in Japan, seen it in Korea, see it all over the world. How do you overcome that barrier to move us forward? Thank you.
Okay, two questions there. How do you leverage governments in a time when governments are all strapped for money? How should we start that off? Paul, thoughts about that? Sorry to pick on you there, but
just sharing some personal thoughts. I would have thought that in these times of, I would say, tight, finances, governments would be more than willing to talk to the private sector, to leverage. I can give you a case in point. Actually, apart from my role as an academic, I'm also a fish farmer. Okay? And we actually have a joint partnership in Malaysia with the Malaysian government through a private company, Norwegian company, where the government basically wanted to create livelihood projects, okay, to have more so-called poor, disenfranchised rural folks participate in fish production. So they came in, they provided the water body, okay, built the infrastructure, roads, and so on. The private sector, this company came in, we're just a joint venture partner there, provided the technology, In this case, fish, new fish technology, both new breeds, as well as the technology to grow the food itself, to grow the fish itself, yeah? And it's a very viable partnership. And the state government, in fact, bought over the company, and the incentive for them to do that was that it's one of the few successful projects where in tight times, the government has been able to leverage its investment with the resources that it has got most access and control over, which is water, the natural resources. Yeah? It doesn't have the technology and investments to actually develop the R&D and the basic fiscal, you could say, the fiscal resources needed to actually, to create a business. So this is just one very small example. I see many of these trending around Asia, of governments actually being able to leverage their ownership of certain common property resources to then work with the private sector and together benefit basically the poorest of the poor. Really. And thanks for picking on me.
Well, let me just keep running down just a couple of responses. I mean, obviously there is a question around the level of investment that's been put in. Is this being constrained by the global environment we find ourselves in at the moment?
Well, I certainly think so, but I think this has been a trend going on before kind of we've seen all the austerity stuff. So it's kind of been the mindset that you've seen this reduction in R&D at a government level, a public sector level, started much longer before we run into the problems in Europe and America and whatnot. So it's a trend that's been going on, and it needs to be addressed. And it's interesting because my impression on this is that this part of the world is a little bit different than the Western world, is where smallholder farmers tend to be poor and disenfranchised. And the reason they don't get the research is because they're not that politically powerful, as they are, as you see in Europe and America, where the politicians, they probably have more political power than their votes would exemplify in that. So I would certainly think if I was a government leader in an Asian country where, if I can do something that would help smallholder farmers, you're helping a lot of voters. So I think it makes a lot of political sense, too.
Well, let me just flip that point to you, Juergen. You've got a lot of experience in and around governments working on agriculture. Can I just say that the voice that, in some countries at least anyway, as this question asked, in some countries the voice of farmers, small-scale farmers, is not especially strong in Parliament and in their institutions. What can be done to rectify that? Is that a problem? And what can be done to rectify it if it is?
Well, let me first come back to your point and your question. I think it actually helps the situation we're in right now. Like Paul was saying, if governments are squeezed for budget, they like innovation. If you come with good ideas, you get a lot of support. We have tremendous response from governments around the world on the Oceans Initiative, for instance. And they are willing to put money in, but you have to come up with a really good solution. It has to be a public-private partnership, and it has to focus on the poor. But I think the issues are out there. Governments, when they swim in money, they don't have to look around. That's just, they do their thing. So it's actually a very good thing to generate this innovation. And then if governments want to help the population, they can do this in good or not so good or bad ways. We've seen a lot of bad policies going around in the last decades, but we've also seen increasingly good policies. You can, instead of having an inward-looking parochial subsidy to help your constituency, you can invest money in global public goods, which helps both your population and it contributes to a higher public good. Like if I take the European Union subsidy policy, they started off with production subsidies, then they became more environmentally focused subsidies, and eventually I think they should move into climate smart agriculture and climate smart management type of support, not agricultural subsidies. So you achieve a political objective, but you don't distort the markets. So there's a lot of interesting debate going on this front.
Andrew.
Yeah, I think, you just got to have the confidence to start small. I think people look at public-private partnerships and think they have to be $100 million building an enormous dam. I mean, we've got PPPs operating in places like Indonesia and Vietnam that are worth $100,000. And they start very small with a couple of hundred growers. And it's about building the confidence and the trust. So I think that's the first point. I think the second thing is, from the private sector's perspective, to your point about how do you get governments to come along, you've got to understand their political imperatives, absolutely. You've got to work within those. And you've got to invest time and effort in understanding the government's objectives. And you've got to you've really got to frame your objectives in the context of the government's objectives and how you can help the government achieve what they want to achieve. Because ultimately, yes, they want food security, they want food stability and these sorts of things. So how can we help bring that to the table? And that can be a vote winner. So you know, there's an onus on us as sort of the bringers of the technology, if you like, to sort of change our lens a little bit. You can't just go in there and say it's good for you. You really got to understand what they're trying to achieve, and it can be done. And I'm with Juergen. I remain extremely optimistic about the opportunity rather than pessimistic at this point. And I think it is, now is the time to be doing exactly what we're doing.
Down here in the front, please.
I'm Renee from Travel Business Analyst. Earlier on, you were talking about the high yields and productivities, the productivity of different farming practices in different countries. So what are these countries doing right, like Thailand, who is a net exporter of rice, as opposed to Indonesia or some countries in Africa? And also, what can the World Bank and Cargill and Syngenta do for countries like Burma that used to be a net exporter of rice and the breadbasket of Asia and now become the economic basket case? Second question. Earlier you're mentioning the voice of the farmer. Would it be possible for a forum like this to invite, let's say, a farmer from Bali? I'm highlighting this case because the Subak system in Bali, the rice irrigation system, won a UNESCO Heritage Award for their terrace farming that dates back to the 9th century. Now, would it be possible to hear the voice of these farmers, how they feel about the threats of the real estate developers who are buying up all the land for tourism projects like hotels and villas?
Okay, which one do we take first? I mean, I think we might have to throw the second question to the organisers of the conference, not to the panellists here. I think it might be a little bit unfair, but can we kick off perhaps on the first question? How do companies like yourself help?
Private sector companies are already doing exactly what you said. As a matter of fact, I'll give you one great example. We worked with about 200 farmers up in northeast China with Coca-Cola on a corn farming process. We just got our results in from the first season of working with these farmers, teaching them on irrigation, good fertilizer use, using the right genetics in northeast China, and it's to my advantage too, because I have a starch processing plant where I buy these guys corn, so I need their corn to be able to turn that into starch, which ends up being sweeteners for Coca-Cola. So there's the supply chain. We all have an interest in these farmers being successful. In one season with 100 farmers, we increased yield by 28%, 28, and we increased the family income by 90%. So these huge yield increases and advancements in the family income can be done. And again, following off of Andrew's point, which is you can start small, and the word of mouth in these farming communities is just fantastic. And next year we're going to expand this program to 3,000 farmers. And just today I announced a $1.3 million program working with farmers in Mozambique. So the private sector is stepping up and trying to put these programs together, and we just need to do more of it, and we need to help and work with other international bodies in the civil society to keep delivering these kinds of things, because the gains can be there.
How can
There is no reason that Burma should not export rice again, right? There's no reason. Let me just say one other thing, and we are working with the private sector and many others to help them get the technology, but also get the enabling environment right. It is not true that large farms are more productive than small farms. The highest production and productivity per hectare actually is on small farms. It's not on large farms. So it has nothing to do with your structure, as a matter of fact. It has to do with all the things that we have just discussed. If in Burma the land use rights get sorted out, if there's no major distorting policies, if they have access to technology and knowledge, what have you, there's no reason why they shouldn't be a world leader in rice production yet again. We're all working together to help them make that happen.
I think also, I mean, it's technology and it's agronomic practices. So it is both. The knowledge is there. Well, sorry, the knowledge is not there, but certainly the technology is. I mean, we've seen with introducing mechanisation for rice farmers in India, yield increases of 30%. I was in Vietnam last week, and there's a program there we've just introduced called the first 45 days, which is when you set the yield potential for a corn crop. And really just through a better combination of chemistry and agronomic practices across, I think it was 17 sites, the average yield increase was 15% average. Return on investment was 9 to 1. So, the farmers were changing their patterns of chemical use. They were actually reducing the level of farm input, so they're reducing the level of chemicals, one shot instead of 3, these sorts of things. So, I mean, absolutely the technology is there, and there's no reason, why it can't be extended to the likes of Burma and other places. And understanding comparative advantage is also extremely important. And I think Indonesia is getting it. They're focused on rice production. They will be rice self-sufficient very shortly. They're looking at the introduction of new technologies in corn. So, I think inherently most of the big agricultural producing countries in Asia do get it. And it's not going to be overnight, but it is happening, and I think it will continue to happen. We're very confident of that.
We have time for one more question down in the front, please. If you could just say your name and organisation as well, please. Thanks.
My name is Pat Lowe. I'm with SMU. I've been here about a year. Prior to that, for the last 7 years, I was working in disaster response around Asia. I've had agricultural projects in Aceh, in Maldives. We're trying to get into Pakistan as well, and we have had agricultural projects in Myanmar. Mostly our pattern from Singapore, which is not a big agricultural nation, is to tap on public donations to help small farmers, 20 hectares or a cooperative of about 100 hectares, get back to farming from zero. They used to be productive farmers, but with either the floods, the tsunami, etc., they went to zero. I have found it extremely difficult to raise funds to support that kind of redevelopment initiatives. People will build houses, people will rebuild schools, but they do not understand rebuilding livelihood. And as somebody here said, when you rebuild livelihoods, they feed themselves, they can send their kids to school, they can rebuild their homes. So especially to the two gentlemen from Syngenta and Cargill, do you have some sources of funding that we could tap into? Because I am focused in my NGO activities on livelihood and food, especially food rehabilitation. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, we do it in a number of ways. We have a Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture, which is probably in the space that you're talking about, that sort of farm reconstruction, and also what we call the sub-commercial farming groups, and they operate projects right around the world. I'm visiting one in Vietnam next week, so sort of bringing them back into mainstream, I think, is certainly where I would see a potential fit. It's also about working technology projects on the ground. We're doing work with the World Economic Forum and others. So I think we've just recently completed a project in Japan where we help farmers rebuild glass houses who were basically destroyed by the Great Eastern Earthquake and tsunami up there. So I think there is an appetite. It's just about understanding what the situation is and working through where the fit is and what it is that we can bring to the table. It's not something that we would not be disposed to. I think it's about looking at it, understanding what the need is, and seeing where it could work and where does it fit in the organisation. Is it a foundation activity? Is it a sort of a reconstruction activity, or is it a commercial activity? And I think all those things are ripe for consideration.
I'd agree with Andrew, and I would say that most food and ag companies are spending millions of dollars working with NGOs and other partnerships around the world. I think if I can give you some suggestions, is number one, have a well thought out proposal, because we're business people. We make business decisions on that, and particularly if you can tie it to one of our supply chains. What's the business case, if you would, for that? So when we do a project, we have to have a business case. I mean, I need corn for my starch facility, so we go out and help corn farmers. The corn farmers win, we win. So the more you can make it a win-win situation, I think you're going to be more successful as you look at international private companies.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're running over time. We're running into lunchtime, which is always a dangerous thing to do. So I think let's break for lunch. But before we do so, I think this has been a really fascinating discussion. I'd really like to put your hands, if you could put your hands together for Juergen, Paul, Bruce, Andrew, and Adam. Thank you.